Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Earth and Space Science 101. This is lecture 24. So today we're going to keep sort of going through geologic time. In the last couple lectures we started with the beginning of Earth history and the Hadean Eon. So that was the first roughly 500 million years. And then in lecture 23 we went through the Archean and Proterozoic eons. So that was a big chunk of geologic time there. That was over 2 billion, almost 3 billion years. Now we're going to be dealing with the last little increment of time. It's really only about a 500 million years, about 544 million years, but it's a really important chunk of time because this is the most recent eon of geologic time. This is the eon of geologic time that we're still in. The name of this eon is called the Phanerozoic. Now, Phanerozoic, if you break that down into what the word actually means, it means phaneros, which is visible, and zoic, which is life. So the history of life is going to be very important during this part of our kind of journey through Earth history. We're going to break this down into two lectures. So we're going to start today with lecture 24. This is the Phanerozoic part 1. We're just going to get through the Paleozoic era. And in the last episode, or the last lecture, lecture 25, we're going to go through the last two eras of the Phanerozoic, which are the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras. So I want to start first with just sort of an overview of the Phanerozoic in general. This is only the last 500 million years. So compared to the 4.5 billion years of Earth history, this is a pretty small increment of time. As you can see here, it's only 13% of all of geologic time. But we have the best records, the most accurate understanding of what was going on during this chunk of time. And because large-scale life evolves during this time, this is definitely going to be the most interesting from a biological perspective. Even from a strictly geological perspective and looking at the plate tectonics and the changes in the Earth's atmosphere that are going on during this eon, we know the most about it simply because it's happened last. And based on the way that things get recorded in geology, with all of these subsequent formations of rock recording Earth history, since they're all recorded one layer on top of the other due to the principle of superposition, we know that all of these more recent layers of rock that are recording the most recent Earth history are going to be represented last. They're going to be closest to the Earth's surface. And so therefore, we know far more about the Phanerozoic eon and with much greater certainty than we did with any of these previous chunks of time. So this is 13% of time. The first thing that I want to cover with this sort of overview of the Phanerozoic in general, this 13% of time that represents the last chunk of Earth history, is what was going on with climate during this time. We talk a lot about modern climate change, man-made or anthropogenic climate change just happening in the last 50 years. And this is definitely a cause for concern and something not to be underestimated by any means. But when you compare it to all of Earth history, we find out that climate has changed very significantly over the last 500 million years and even before the last 500 million years. So climate is always changing, and when it changes very rapidly, the way that we're seeing climate change happen today, that's when things are affected in the biosphere. That's when life is going to suffer. And not necessarily because the climate change has happened, but because it's happened so rapidly that life can't evolve fast enough to keep up with those changes, and you get mass extinctions as a result. So if we look at this slide right here, we see the changing climate that's happened over just the last 500 million years, or 544 million years. This is the Phanerozoic climate change. So climate, whether you're looking at the low frequency mode, the red line, or the short-term averages, the blue line, you can see that climate has varied very, very significantly over the last 500 million years, getting much, much colder than it is today and even much, much warmer than it is today. On average, if you look at the entire Phanerozoic, the conditions that we're experiencing today are actually much colder than it's been in most of the geologic past. Take, for instance, when the dinosaurs were around and the Mesozoic era, the periods of time marked at the bottom of the slide with the T, R, J, and K. Conditions were much, much warmer, and that was pretty critical for the dinosaurs' evolution and success during that era. The fact that climate changed very rapidly at the end of that era is responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs and many other organisms during that time. If you look at the end of a period marked with a P down at the bottom of the graph between 300 and 250 million years ago, at the end of that chunk of time, you see this spike towards temperatures increasing. And we had another great die-off, another great mass extinction happen during that time. There have been 5 episodes that we have called mass extinctions, 5 points in geologic time that the geologists go back to and say this is when many, many species have died off. And all during this time and all because of changes in climate that happened more rapidly than life could really sustain and keep up with and evolve to adapt to. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind going forward, is that so much of the drivers for these changes in life on the planet are going to be these external drivers. It's not like life was evolving on a static planet. Life is evolving to keep up with a dynamic or ever-changing planet, and climate is going to be one of the factors that is going to affect these changes. The other thing that life had to keep up with was the changes in the actual surface of the Earth, the changes in where the oceans were and where the continents were. And that, in turn, also affects climate. The position of the continents and the position of the oceans and the ocean currents, all of those things are going to be drivers in climate change. So what you're going to see next over the next few slides is going to be these pictures that are going to change with each point in geologic time and express what we think the position of the continents looked like at various points in the Earth's past. We're going to start sort of where we left off in the last lecture, which was the very end of the Proterozoic. So this is somewhere along the lines of about 600 million years ago. We see that the continents are divided, the continents are spread out across the globe. And this was pretty crucial for the success of life towards the end of the Proterozoic and then the beginning of the Phanerozoic, and this push and move towards life diversifying and evolving and becoming much larger and adapting to this environment. It was all of this shallow marine environment surrounding these continents. The continents themselves are still barren at this time. So now as we progress through time, we go from 600 million years ago to 560 to 540, and now at 540 million years ago, we're pretty firmly in what we're calling the Phanerozoic eon. The earliest period in the Paleozoic, which is an era within the Phanerozoic, is called the Cambrian period. So now we can see we have even more shallow marine environments and nice warm sort of tropical parts of the globe, and that's going to be really crucial for the success of these shallow marine organisms that are going to become large and become sort of masters of their environment. So then we go to 500 million years ago, and we're going to keep progressing through time through the entire Paleozoic, where we have these continents moving around, clumping together, forming supercontinents. And eventually, when we keep progressing through time and we get to about 260 million years ago, we get to the late Permian period, and you can see that instead of having all of these separate continents, we have one large continent. All of these continents have sort of melded together. They've all pushed together, forming lots of mountains in the interior of this continent and one big supercontinent configuration. This is the supercontinent that you're probably the most familiar with and you've heard of at various points throughout this class and probably even before this class. This was the great supercontinent Pangaea, the most recent supercontinent on Earth. With the formation of this supercontinent, you get all of these changes in climate, and with these changes in climate, you get all of these changes and potentially mass extinctions in life. So if there's anything that I want to emphasize throughout the study of geologic time, it's that all of these things are interconnected. What's going on with the surface of the Earth, what's happening with the geology, what's happening with the Earth's atmosphere and its climate, and what's happening with life. So all of these things working together are going to either create environments where life can thrive or create environments where life can no longer sustain conditions on the surface of the Earth and species go extinct as a result. You get mass extinctions. So as we move past that mass extinction and past the supercontinent, we get into the Triassic, ultimately into the Jurassic periods. So we're firmly in the Mesozoic at this point, and we see the supercontinent finally begin to break apart. And so finally, by the end of the Mesozoic, we see what's starting to sort of take form as these continents that we know and love today. Sea levels are really high. Things look a little weird. We still have a Pacific Ocean that's really too big compared to the rest of the continents on Earth. But we are beginning to kind of assume a position of the continents that makes some kind of sense to us today. And then as we go from the late Cretaceous period throughout the Cenozoic era, the continents continue to spread out across the globe and eventually come to the positions that we know today, with an Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, Southern Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and this specific position of all of these continents today. Ultimately, in the future, we think that there will be another supercontinent, but that's hundreds of millions of years in the future. Now I want to go back and give you a little bit more insight into some of these names that I kept throwing around throughout that whole study of paleogeography and looking at all of those different maps. I used these names of eras and periods, and to me, I know they come fairly easily because I've used these my entire career, but for you, you're going to have to spend a little bit more time thinking about these. A quick reminder, you're only responsible for the names of the eons. So there are 4 eons of geologic time: the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic. And you're also responsible for the eras of the Phanerozoic, which are the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Of those, we're going to cover the Paleozoic today, and Paleozoic basically just means old life. Most of the Paleozoic is going to be life restricted to the oceans, so we're going to talk about marine life. And then finally, towards the end of the Paleozoic, life will finally sort of emerge from the oceans and start to conquer the continents. And then we'll cover the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic in the next lecture. So sort of in summary for the Paleozoic, this first, roughly 300 million years of the Phanerozoic, we see that life is going to become way more interesting than it really was in the Proterozoic and certainly in the Archean. It's no longer going to be restricted to only bacterial life. Life is going to evolve into these forms that fossilize really well. So our knowledge of this part of Earth history in terms of the biology of Earth history is going to become a little bit more concrete. We know that oxygen is going to keep increasing in the Earth's atmosphere because back in the Proterozoic, an event that really defines the beginning of the Proterozoic, life figured out how to undergo photosynthesis and start to pump oxygen into the Earth's atmosphere, removing the carbon dioxide, cooling down temperatures. And another side effect of this is that as the oxygen increases in the Earth's atmosphere, so too does a molecule that's similar to oxygen called ozone. The only difference between the molecular oxygen that we breathe in the Earth's atmosphere that's so abundant and ozone is one extra oxygen atom. So molecular oxygen is just O2, ozone is O3, and it's found in its greatest concentration in the upper atmosphere, and it protects the Earth's surface from some of the more harmful UV radiation. So not only does oxygen in the atmosphere enable large-scale organisms to evolve and to thrive, it also enables the presence of ozone, which makes it possible for life to eventually get out of the oceans and onto the continents where they're more exposed to these UV rays. And then finally, as we get to the end of the Paleozoic, we'll look at how some of the mountains in the eastern part of the United States eventually formed and the great supercontinent Pangaea eventually formed. So we've got lots to talk about during this chunk of time. I want to just briefly cover, even though I want to emphasize you are not responsible for memorizing these names, that there are individual periods within the Paleozoic, and I might be using some of these terms. You can basically just think about these as early and middle and late Paleozoic. It's a little bit easier to remember that way. The first period of the Paleozoic is called the Cambrian period, which is why this first event that we're going to talk about is called the Cambrian explosion. It's this diversification of life. We'll get to that in a minute. After the Cambrian comes the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, and all of those terms, the Cambrian through the Devonian, they all come from these regions of England and Great Britain where these sort of type fossils for this particular age rock were found. So areas around Devonshire or areas around Cambridge. And so that's where some of these names are originating. It does kind of make it a little bit hard to remember these names, though, which is why I'm not actually requiring you to memorize them. After the Devonian comes a period of time called the Carboniferous. Sometimes that's subdivided into Mississippian and Pennsylvanian, but either way, you're not responsible for memorizing those period names. And then finally, the last period within the Paleozoic is called the Permian. So particularly the Cambrian and the Permian, you might hear me talk about a lot, but you can basically think about these as the beginning and the end, respectively, of the Paleozoic. So the first event that I want to talk about within the Paleozoic that occurred during the Cambrian period is, of course, this Cambrian explosion that we keep referencing. Now, when we think about what was happening with the evolution of life at the end of the Proterozoic, we had all of these organisms that were becoming multicellular. They were actual animals, and so they were, in some cases, moving around, in some cases, restricted to one environment, but living on the seafloor. But they didn't fossilize very well. So for the longest time, for hundreds of years, geologists that were beginning to understand geologic time didn't really know of their existence. They thought that the beginning of the Cambrian period was actually the beginning of large-scale life on Earth, simply because this is when large-scale life with things like bones and shells and things that fossilize really well, that's when these organisms finally evolved. So we do have large-scale life beginning to sort of thrive at the very end of the Proterozoic, so even before the Cambrian period, but because they didn't fossilize very well. We think of this as sort of this big moment in time where large-scale life actually evolved. It's simply because this is when you see the most of it in the fossil record. Particularly in places like the Burgess Shale in Canada, you have these places where lots and lots of different organisms that were just starting to really thrive during this time are preserved. And what really sort of happened at this point is that all of a sudden conditions became perfect for life. And this is still restricted to the shallow marine environment, but conditions became really sort of ideal for a life to thrive at this point. And so you have all of these different sorts of organisms, some with really great defensive mechanisms, like all of these hard parts, these shells, this ability to become predators, this ability to move around in their environment, all sort of competing for these ecological niches. And that's what evolution is really all about. It's all about having all of these individual organisms through subsequent generations become better adapted to their environment so that they can really sort of fight this battle with other organisms that are trying to do the same thing. And the best adapted to that individual environment is the one that ends up being the most successful and the most likely to survive. And so those are the ones that don't end up going extinct. A lot of these species that evolved during the Cambrian didn't make it out of the Cambrian period, and we haven't seen them since. So they didn't really make it through that battle. But the ones that did were the best adapted to that environment. So I wanted to paint you a little bit of a picture of what this all really looked like. By the end of the late Proterozoic, it's all these soft things, all these soft organisms on the seafloor. All of these things that are sort of similar to jellyfish and anemones today, and sea fans. That's what the late Proterozoic looked like, all this soft stuff that did not preserve very well. And only in places of exceptional preservation did those actually thrive. Then by the time you get to the Cambrian period, you've got all these shelled organisms, all these sort of warriors of the seafloor. And some of these organisms have actually survived from this point all the way on forward. So Once we get outside of the Cambrian period, once we get past the Cambrian and into the Ordovician, a lot of those organisms aren't going to make it to this point, but the ones that do become more complex, in some cases become even better adapted to their environment and better able to really master their environment through becoming top predators. And that's when you get some of the very beginnings of things that are going to look like fish, some of the very beginnings of things that are eventually going to evolve into vertebrates, like these jawless fish. So it's a really interesting sort of succession of events here that starts with lots of different organisms. Not all of them are going to survive. The ones that do survive are going to become really honed into their environment and are going to be the best able to survive in that environment. Now, so I'm going to eventually talk a lot about these organisms that are eventually going to descend into fish and descend into the first vertebrates. But I want to talk for just a minute about some of the organisms that go sort of in the opposite direction, the invertebrate animals. We have things, they're going to look a lot like shelled organisms in the sea today. Most of the time when you go looking for things like seashells, you're looking at the remains of bivalves and mollusks. And certainly some of these were around during the end of the Cambrian period and the beginning of the Ordovician, but so too were a lot of other organisms, things like brachiopods and crinoids and bryozoans, lots of different types of coral. And many of these would eventually end up going extinct at the end of the Cambrian period. So the sea floor is going to look very, very different compared to the way that the sea floor looks today, simply because you have very, very different types of organisms that are thriving in this world that's maybe similar to Earth as it is today, but also different. So I wanted to just kind of point out some of those to you. And then finally, we're going to get into the Silurian period, and we're going to see some of the first plants, some of the first jawless fish, and then as we go from the Silurian and into the Devonian periods, you really see definitively the first vertebrates, the first true vertebrates. So some of those jawless fish of the Ordovician and the Silurian are going to develop actual backbones, actual vertebral columns, and that's really important because that's essentially one of the hallmarks of humans as well, is we are vertebrate organisms. We have a backbone. All mammals are vertebrate organisms. All reptiles and birds and amphibians, all of these fish, with the exception of some of these sort of weird fish of the Ordovician and Silurian, these are all vertebrate organisms. So we're sort of in a sense seeing our distant ancestors when we see the beginnings of these first vertebrates. They have to undergo a lot of changes. They're eventually going to evolve to be able to conquer the continents. All of these different things have to happen towards the end of the Paleozoic, but here is sort of the beginning right here. We also see the beginning of things that are sort of walking around on four legs, the tetrapods. They're going to really kind of come into their own, even though still at this point we really have all of these different types of weird life still pretty firmly restricted to the oceans. I would say it isn't until after the Devonian that you see the first true emergence of life from the oceans and then onto the continents. So the next thing that I want to talk about is how these vertebrate organisms are going to eventually make their way onto the continents. Like so many other things in the evolution of life, it all has to happen in these extremely small incremental stages. You have to start with these vertebrate organisms, these fish in the oceans, and then they find ways to sort of conquer the continents. They become amphibians. They have this ability to live both in the water and on land. Now, the marked difference between amphibians and reptiles is going to be the fact that amphibians always have to go back to the water to be able to reproduce and to lay their eggs, because their eggs have to be submerged in water. That's why when you see baby frogs, for instance, they're tadpoles. They've hatched out of eggs that were in the water, and they're swimming around at first, and then they eventually are going to be capable of moving on land as well. So the thing that's going to really kind of change all of that and make it possible for some of these types of organisms to live exclusively on land and to be able to separate their existence out of the water entirely is this thing called the amniotic egg. The amniotic egg is going to proceed from this point forward as this main way that life is going to be able to not have to go back to the water to lay eggs. And this is going to follow through with first the reptiles and then birds and even mammals. All are going to rely on this amniotic egg. So with an amphibian egg, you have this gelatinous material outside of the actual embryo, but that is going to be heavily reliant on the presence of water. In an amniotic egg, you have, in most cases, a hard shell and lots of individual layers that protect the embryo from all of these problems of desiccation, of drying out, of predation that are going to happen when you try to have these organisms laying eggs on the surface of the earth instead of being in the water. And so the amniotic egg is really the thing that you can point to say this is the main reason why reptiles were able to remove their existence from the water entirely. So as a kind of funny thing, when you hear all the time that old adage, what came first, the chicken or the egg? When you think about chickens, they wouldn't actually evolve until far, far later. We have to get really firmly into arguably the Mesozoic or even maybe the Cenozoic before you see the emergence of birds. The amniotic egg is going to evolve far earlier than that. So biologically, you can say that what came first, the chicken or the egg? It's definitely the egg that came first and that the chicken would come way later. So the other thing that you have to kind of talk about when you're talking about all of these changes in vertebrate life and all of these changes in animal life is what are all these organisms going to eat? In order for life to really conquer the continents and get out of the oceans, you have to have something there for these organisms to eat. And that would happen towards the late Devonian and then finally definitely into the Carboniferous as well, as this emergence of plant life from the oceans and onto the continents. You could even make the argument that plants have to evolve and adapt to an environment first before the animals can, or there's really nothing for them to eat there. So even before the emergence of amphibians and reptiles onto the continent, you first have to have the first really true terrestrial plant species. And those plant species were these things called lycopods. They're similar to ferns. They're evolutionarily much different than most of the trees and grasses and bushes that we have on Earth today. They were very, very simple, but they were capable of actually moving water up the stalk, and so the entire plant could be alive and filtering water all at the same time. So with the emergence of animals, you first have to have this emergence of plants. It starts with things like mosses, and mosses don't need a vascular structure. They don't really need a way of moving water up the column because mosses are all about just sort of covering the surface of things. Now, you might immediately sort of jump when you think about mosses to Spanish moss. Spanish moss is actually not a true type of moss. It's more closely related to things like pineapples and bromeliads, plants like that, than they are to true mosses. True mosses just sort of are a kind of fuzzy green covering on rocks and on the ground surface. So first you have mosses cover terrestrial environments, and then eventually vascular plants like ferns. Eventually you would have plants that actually create seeds, gymnosperms, and eventually angiosperms, but they wouldn't really evolve until deep, deep in the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. So when you think about plants covering the surface of the earth, it didn't happen such that you immediately had this evolution of grasses and trees and forests. That's not what the surface of the earth looked like at this point. You had maybe 3-foot tall lycopods. And you had maybe mosses covering the surface. So it was a very sort of minimalist plant existence at this time. Now, these plants, once they really started to completely cover the continents and they got a little bit bigger, they got a little bit more complex, they emerged away from the lycopods into taller plants. There was really a lot of plant material around at this time. And when all of those organisms died, especially if there was fresh water around, all of that plant material would sink down to the bottom of all of that fresh water and become compacted by subsequent layers of plants dying off and packing on top of it. This is where most of the world's coal comes from. It's from this really sort of first generation of terrestrial plants that were covering the surface of the earth at this time and dying off in massive droves. And all of this plant material is eventually going to be compacted by subsequent layers of deposition of sediment and compacted and desiccated to form coal. Most of the world's coal is coming from this material. So by the end of the Carboniferous period, or the late Pennsylvanian, if you prefer, the surface of the earth would have looked like much like what you'd probably imagine a jungle to look like today. Lots of tall, very sort of ferny, bright green plants, some mosses. None of the trees, though, that you're used to seeing around on Earth today. No pines, no oak trees, no flowering plants of any kind. Just things that look a lot like ferns today. And all of that swamp plant material eventually gets converted to coal. That's why we call this period of time the Carboniferous. All that carbon and all of that coal, that's just going to come from these terrestrial plants. And this is going to provide an environment and a food source for all of these terrestrial animals, all these reptiles and eventually bird-like organisms that are going to evolve later on. So then, the story of life on planet Earth really kind of moves away from dealing strictly with the oceans, even though still, even at this time and even on to today, most of the world's species live in the oceans. But the story is going to become much more interesting because in addition to all of these organisms living in all these marine environments, you also have organisms covering the surface of the Earth. So we have amphibians and reptile-like amphibians and lots of really, really interesting invertebrate organisms. 3 to 5 foot dragonflies in the air, huge scorpions moving around on Earth. The presence of oxygen was so high at this time that the original bugs on Earth, for lack of a better word, the original insects and arachnids on Earth, they would have become really, really large compared to their size today. So that's one of those things I always like to kind of talk to everybody and get you to kind of think about. If you're ever given access to a time machine, you want to go back to various points in Earth history, you really want to study that point in Earth history before you become really committed to the idea. Like, you don't want to go back to the very beginning of the Earth history because that moon forming impact is probably going to happen at that time. You don't want to go back to any point in the first couple billion years of Earth history because temperatures would have been miserably, miserably hot. You would have immediately gone extinct. And then even this time, unless you really like the idea of giant insects flying around and crawling around on the Earth's surface, this period of time probably wouldn't be for you either. So all of these organisms are going to continue to evolve. They're going to continue to get more and more similar to life that we have today. And things are going to be looking really, really good. But you have to remember that at the end of the Permian period, all of those continents are all going to assemble together as one big supercontinent. And the changes in climate that are going to happen because of that event are going to really test life on planet Earth. So, once we get towards the end of the Permian, things are going to be looking really, really great. We even have some things that are going to look almost similar to the dinosaurs that are going to really evolve in the next chunk of time. You've got some things that look fairly similar to mammals in the form of these therapsids. They're going to be somewhat similar to the mammals that are going to evolve towards the end of the Mesozoic and the beginning of the Cenozoic. But let's kind of take a pause on what's going on with life for a second and go back to what's going on with the position of the continents. When we see the formation of Pangea, it kind of happens in stages. It's starting really as far back as into the Carboniferous period, around 300 million years ago, going all the way up through the Permian period. You have bodies of rock, all these island arcs, all of these small continents are going to be colliding together on what is now the east coast of North America to form the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains really formed in three subsequent stages, culminating in two larger continents colliding together. Now, the best analogy that I can come up with for this event with today's continents is when India first slammed up into Asia and started to uplift the Himalayan mountains. The Appalachian Mountains are kind of small, kind of stunted compared to a lot of the world's mountains today, with the high points in the Appalachian Mountains being in the 6,000-foot range. But at this time, these mountains would have been even taller than Mount Everest, taller than the Himalayas today. These would have been the largest mountains on Earth, and forming as a result of the same assemblage of continents, the same collision of continents that's going to form the supercontinent Pangea. So we can actually see this through these paleogeographic maps, through the early Mississippian, which is the same as the Carboniferous, so roughly a little over 300 million years ago. We see still a body of water separating what is now North America from what you could sort of argue is modern-day Europe. And then these are going to continue to collide over the next roughly 100 million years to form, in earnest, the Himalayan mountains. So all that uplifted terrain that you see in the eastern part of North America is really sort of the Appalachian Mountains, all forming through parts of the collisions that are going to form Pangea. Now, once you take all of these continents and put them all together in one place on Earth, this is going to absolutely change climate. And the same thing would happen today if you just suddenly took all of the different continents on Earth and slammed them all together all in one space on Earth. What this does is that it insulates the mantle, like putting a blanket over the Earth and causing heat to really sort of concentrate in the mantle of the Earth. And all of that heat is going to want to rise. All of this hot, now liquid rock is going to want to rise. And this is how mantle plumes are formed. All of this hot, molten rock is going to rise up through the mantle and move up towards the Earth's surface. And the thing that's going to happen as a result of this is the rifting of the continent, the destruction of the Pangean supercontinent as it starts to break apart and move apart the globe, and lots and lots and lots of volcanic activity. And one of the things that happens as a result of volcanic activity that we've talked about in the past in this class is the emergence of lots of sulfuric acid, lots of sulfur dioxide, and most importantly, a vast quantity of carbon dioxide. So this event, to compare it to climate change that's happening on Earth today, would have dumped probably 10 times as much CO2 as we have dumped in the entire industrial revolution, all within maybe a single year into the Earth's atmosphere. So this causes temperatures to skyrocket on Earth. And again, this is all happening really rapidly. If it had happened more slowly, then it's possible that still some species of life would have died out, but some would have maybe thrived. Some would have evolved with all these slow changes to be able to keep up with those changes and to adapt and to survive. But because this all happened so rapidly, this rapid increase in temperatures, you have a great die-off, especially in the oceans. Now, the secondary thing that's thought to be the cause of this extinction is the release of something called methane hydrates from the seafloor, from the shallow marine seafloor. So let me paint you a little picture here. You have all of this increase in CO2 that's causing global warming to happen, and it happens pretty rapidly. There are these things that are going to be stored in the shallow marine environment that we have on Earth today. This is a possible end result of climate change that we could see in the next few hundred years. If global temperatures get warm enough in the atmosphere, and most importantly in the oceans, you destabilize this methane that's trapped in these ice crystals, and that's what a methane hydrate is. It's essentially a little ball of methane gas that's trapped in these little ice crystals. You destabilize that from the sea floor. And then once that methane is released into the Earth's atmosphere, that methane is 10 times as potent of a greenhouse gas as CO2 is. So then that sort of causes a snowball effect. It exacerbates the change in temperature, and temperatures are going to skyrocket even further. So all of this happened in, geologically speaking, a relatively short period of time, and life couldn't evolve fast enough to keep up with those changes. So what happens as a result of this is that we have a worldwide extinction. I don't want to make it sound like this is just something that's happening in the oceans, but 95% of marine species at this time. So this is 95% of all of the individual species that were around on the seafloor. They're gone. They're extinct. They're history. 70% of terrestrial organisms, so lots of these different vertebrate organisms, lots of these different reptiles and amphibians, lots of these different plants, their history, they go extinct. This is the single worst mass extinction in the planet's entire history. And it happened so much similar to what we're going through today with events that triggered a vast increase in global temperatures. The only difference is that this event that happened in the past, this was a natural event. This happened because of the breakup of Pangaea. What's happening on Earth today with the increase in global temperatures due to the burning of fossil fuels, this is a man-made event. And I'm not saying that a end Permian mass extinction event is likely in the next 100 years, but unchecked in the next 400 or 500 years, we could see an event like this happening on Earth. So that's going to, somewhat depressingly, end the Paleozoic era of the Phanerozoic eon. So as a quick reminder, where we're at in geologic time is that we've essentially gone through the first roughly half of the Phanerozoic. The Paleozoic spans from 544 million years ago to about 251 million years ago. In the next lecture, we're going to pick up at 251 million years ago with the beginning of the Mesozoic era. So excitingly, we get to talk about the dinosaurs. And then we're going to go from the Mesozoic era into the Cenozoic era when we finally get to see humans evolve at the very, very end of the Cenozoic era and the very end of our coverage of geologic time. So that's it for today. Until next time, keep rocking.